I'd like to make this transition to something that fascinates me about your work, and that is the way you integrate, well, two parts. What did you see that sort of flowed through the various traditions that you were able to document? That's one part, and the other part has to do with ancestors and how you saw that sort of flowing into these traditions. Is that too broad?
No, it's not too broad. I just, it's been a very full evening, right? And the questions have been wonderful. And this was our first time meeting, so it was somewhat emotional for me because we've been on the phone so much. So the traditions, some of them are what we now call like the best practices. And there were definitely lots of similarities. I was in Ghana, I was in Ethiopia, and I was in Kenya. So among the traditions that were present in all three places, and of course there's various cultures within those countries, but one of them was, as I mentioned earlier, was massage. Massage was at the core of the practices everywhere that I talked to midwives. And massage was used not only during the prenatal period to determine whether or not the mom was pregnant in the first place, right? And to determine how pregnant she might be, not in terms of months, but just, you know, we're so specific about calendar, but it's just a whole different way of seeing time. Like, you know, early, you still have lots of time left. Let's talk about the vegetables that you need to eat, the grains, and so forth. That was one phase, early stage of massage. And then the other time would be approaching birth. And when they were seeing the mother, you know, throughout the pregnancy, and they were massaging the mother to see the position of where the baby actually was. And if there was concern towards the end of the pregnancy, the skills that these women had to be able to turn the baby were so recognized in Kenya that there were like front page newspaper articles in the mainstream press about particular black women who actually had relationships with hospitals, and they were actually, you know, turning babies, and these were skills that the doctors did not have. There was a midwife in Kenya who would be called in, this is recent years, again to prevent the cesarean section, to do the massaging needed to turn the baby. So that I also learned about in Alabama. That the women in Alabama, who are in the book as well, talk about massage also being something as a time of a very spiritual moment. So, you know, humming or singing or going to that space where they're connecting with their spirit, their God, or however they call that spirit. But that was a time that it was technical, but it was also very, very spiritual. And there was a second part to your question.
Well, I think you've kind of pulled it in. So that's an African tradition that you also found in places like Alabama. And then the ancestral part, you mentioned ancestors in your work.
Yeah. So to me, one of the real, I guess, tragedies in terms of knowing the value of the black women in our community is to understand that practices that were being dismissed as being superstitious, as being backwards, as being a sign of ignorance, were actually practices that had to do with having herbal knowledge, which had to do with hand skills, which had to do with being able to attend multiple births, which had to do with centering, burial of the afterbirth is another one that's really strong, really strong. When I was in Ghana, they finally convinced about the importance of burying the afterbirth and that it was a part of their practice. And so what was being dismissed by some as superstition is African traditions, and that black midwives kept alive African traditions that were from the time, you know, those of us who came through the Middle Passage, passed on to their daughters, to their daughters, to their daughters. And unfortunately, when I was doing the interviews in 1981, they would say things like, well, I'm not sure where it comes from, but my mother told me I had to do this, or my grandmother told me I had to do this. I mean, you would rarely hear someone say, or they would say, we've been doing this, my great-great-grandmother who was enslaved did this, right? And then she passed it on. So it became very clear to me, and that's what led me to go to the continent, because I started realizing 4 generations back, these women were able to continue traditions that were threatened by enslavement, that were threatened by doctors trying to do away with their practices. And even when they came up with these rules, like they did in Ghana recently, that you can't take the afterbirth and bury the afterbirth, the midwives defied the rules. They were like, they don't know what we're doing when we come back to our communities. They're at the health department in town somewhere, that we can continue the traditions that really mean the most to us when we are on our home base and in our communities, and making our black pepper tea or our ginger tea to encourage. And there was this respect. It wasn't like they said, this comes from Africa. They say, this comes from my mama, this comes from my grandmama, this comes from my great-grandmama. And then being able to go to the continent and hear them say, this comes from my mama, this comes from my great-grandmama, but also to connect it with their own traditional, spiritual, religious practices. So that's the difference. Whereas in the South, it was coped in it was in the language of Jesus and Christianity, but there, whether it was Muslim or traditional African religions, they would be able to put it in that context.
Do we have more questions before I continue with mine? Just in the back. So what fascinates me about your work is how that firsthand access that you have to people who are working as professional in the sense of being community created and shaped, people that are organically coming out of a community and continuing, learning a skill and continuing that skill, and then you having this kind of access to them. And I just wonder how that went. Did you have to make yourself known first? Did they trust you? Did they think that, did they embrace you? I'm sure this was different in the different locations, but how were you sort of accepted as this person from the outside?
Yeah. Well, I kind of talked about it first in Alabama because that was 1981. So I was really worried. I was coming from New Jersey. They didn't know my mama. I wasn't from their village. And only in Selma, Alabama did I have some folks that were able to say, oh, Linda's okay. She's been to the house. She's a friend of my daughter and all that. But what I found in 1981 is that the midwives themselves had just been dismantled brutally without any respect or recognition of their work. They were sent letters in the mail. Some of them were a white nurse would knock on their door and say, "You're done." And their mother was a midwife, their grandmother was a midwife. And so that was in 1978, I think they passed the law that literally eliminated midwife practices. And all of the midwives on the final list, or the only list that was done, it was like over 100 midwives at that time. But at one point, it was like in the 50s, it was like thousands still in Alabama. There was one white midwife on the list. But when I went to Alabama and talked to midwives, they were so pleased that somebody was interested in their story, because they were being told, we don't need midwives anymore, that it's not safe for the mother, it's not safe for the babies, and so that this generations of traditions were just literally being thrown out the window. So I was surprised, quite frankly, that I could literally, most women had phones, but there were some women who didn't have phones, that I could kind of knock on a door and say, is it okay for us to talk? Which is one of the reasons why, with this thing with Smith College, I just feel that they trusted me. And my daughter and I've talked about this a lot, right? So that when I'm opening, I've had a lot of, about opening it up in terms of not knowing who's going to have access. But we've worked on that. People are going to have to contact me and so forth before they would have access. But they were really wanting to tell their stories. And they wanted others to know their stories. And that's why I'm comfortable with the book. Because they had been, by mainstream media, yes, but in their communities, though, they were celebrated. The historically black newspapers, if you're interested in learning more about midwives, if you go to historically, you'll see the stories of midwives. Now, on the continent, I was really worried. I don't speak the language, right? And I was telling the cab driver who brought us over here, that one of the beautiful things about Ethiopia was the sense of being black. And I didn't expect it, but literally the children would come up to me, we didn't speak the same language, and they would say, "It's black, you're black, I'm black, we are black," right? And that was the sense I had also in talking to the midwives. And when I went there, I didn't say that I'm an anthropologist, because I'm not. I didn't say that I'm doing a study, because I'm not. I said that I am a mother, I am a grandmother, and that my ancestors are from the continent. And there's this, I'm sure others have experienced this rejoicing of this idea that the ability to return, right? Because in some ways it was unimaginable that we would be able to come back. So there's this sense of, oh, the other thing I said was, I'm not just here to talk to you about your midwife work, but is there anything that you want to discuss about what's going on now in terms of the birthing facilities, in terms of how midwives are being treated, that I will include that also in the work that I'm doing and make sure to let the health departments know and so forth about your concerns. And so, there was this sense, but even before I got to all that, it was just the joy, again, similar to the midwives, the joy that I have come all this way to hear their stories when other people are, and this is happening on the continent now, similar, that the traditional birth attendants are being told, well, you need to get some training, you need to do it the more modern way, but I'm saying, no, I respect what you do, I value what you do, and what you're doing was continued by my ancestors because we are descendants of the same ancestors.
While you were there, did you tell them the stories of the granny midwives that you interviewed? And how did they, if you did tell them, what was their reactions to know that through the Middle Passage, that the traditions that started on the continent survived even to this day? Like, how did they feel about knowing that as well?
Well, so the first part of the answer to that is that at one point I was getting really disturbed about what was going on with the training with the midwives, and I started, is this starting all over again? Like what we experience in the United States, they're getting more medicalized and all of that. So I was really worried about that. And one of the things that happened, I was talking to someone who's really doing a lot of research in Ghana about herbal traditional medicines, supported by the University of Ghana, on really, really important work. And I said, this is really scary, what's going on? And he said, wait a minute, didn't you just tell me that midwives in the United States somehow managed through the Middle Passage, through enslavement, through whatever, to keep these practices alive? So I think the midwives, that when I told them that there were midwives in Alabama that were continuing, it was like a time of rejoicing in a sense. And when I was in Ghana and I thought about the afterbirths being buried under the ground that I was standing on, because I watched them prepare. It's almost like a ceremonial kind of thing. And I realized I could be standing on an afterbirth in that soil of my ancestors. And this whole idea of seeing the afterbirth as part of life, and that these women in Alabama continue to do that. But I think the other thing is the total, there's no way to know this, right? So to hear this in my story to them, I think it may have been what helped to open the door to them willing to trust me, because that would be, and the other thing I think too is that what we're really good at as Black people, because we've been so faced with all kinds of crap, that we're pretty good at reading people. So I know that there were times that, that happened, I felt it really in Alabama too, that sometimes they would just I would have to center myself before I went into the space. Like I would have to go into meditation because it's like reading me, right? That I know that these particularly older women are very good at looking beneath my skin, my black skin, to try to assess my spirit. And so that I was very grateful, but I had to be very mindful of respecting them and mindful of understanding that what they've been doing all of these centuries, via this passing on from ancestors, that we're able to continue this because it's been passed on. But the women were very, very good at making sure that I stayed centered in myself even before I got out of the van or the car that I was in.
Just to raise your hand if you have a question. Did I see one in the back from someone who didn't? Okay, here you go.
Oh, I had one. I had a question. Ms. Holmes, I want to go back to Listen to Me Good, and when we talk about how white domination eviscerated traditional black midwifery in Alabama, with Margaret Charles Smith, in the book you discussed how after they stripped her livelihood, she had to become a domestic worker. When you interviewed some of the other traditional midwives, what did life look like after that assault by white domination on traditional midwifery?
So one of the things that I did ask was, have you considered practicing underground? And so these were black women who were older for the most part and had seen the worst of, not the worst because it's still going on, but different expressions of white supremacy, were just said, we don't want to go to jail, right? Period. They were older and they knew that they would not be, unlike the white women who were practicing, quote, underground and were not arrested, right? And even now, I just got a call from the, what is it, the lawyers group that represents, one of the major lawyers organizations was about what's going on in Florida in terms of black birthing centers and black midwives being assaulted.
Southern poverty law?
Yeah, something like that. But that wanting to know more about what midwives in Alabama were saying, because they're not being treated the same way as the white midwives who are doing home births and the white midwives who are doing birth center births. And so they pretty much accepted it. However, I was really, really felt defeated about the whole thing. And in some ways, this book has kind of, like, I'm feeling far more in the birthing justice movement than I did when I left Alabama, when I thought, oh, maybe this is the end. Clearly, it's not the end. But Annie Lee James said to me, what is wrong with you? Midwives have always been with us. And no matter what these men are trying to do to get rid of midwives, it ain't gonna happen. The midwives are always going to be with us. And, I just said, oh, this is her Christianity way of thinking about the Old Testament and Moses and all that, But in fact, I am convinced that much of what is black culture, which is African culture, whether it's midwifery expression, whether it's music, whether it's in the words, whether it's in respect for the ancestors, that, we're going to keep that. Whether it's Sankofa bookstore, the spirit of our strength is incredible. And I think that's what drives the folks that are trying to destroy us crazy, because we keep rising up again.
In fact, we had someone asked if they could bury their child's placenta here at Sankofa.
here as an outdoors order.
Out front there.
So what is
So,
this?
I mean, well,
Well, the thing is, I guess the problem with that would be you might have a trail of people coming.
there's some issues that we just
And
don't know how
also-
to handle those issues.
And also, I think you could say that that's not the tradition. I think you could also point out that the tradition is not to go find someplace. It's about keeping near the homestead, right? And it doesn't have to be in the ground. I mean, that's the other thing I think about traditions, that there are people that feel that the tradition has to be the puristic tradition from 10,000 years ago, or even like some of the African stuff we could say from 1,000,000 years ago. But, we can modify, we can consider where we live now in
Right.
these urban communities and what makes sense.
And what home means.
And
to
what
us
home
now.
means,
That's
yes.
how we survived so far, is redefining all of that.
Yes.
That's why I'm in such admiration of what you've done, because you defined what was important and you kind of went after it. I think sometimes we feel like there is so much loss in our culture that we focus on the loss.
Mm-hmm.
And we feel like we have post-trauma PTSD, and we should get medicines for being depressed and etc. But in fact, one of the best remedies for PTSD, I'm not a medical person, but I find, let's just me say on a personal level, one of the best remedies for that kind of bad feeling for me is to figure out a way to resist. It's medicine. It's medicine. So the fact that you said, okay, what we've been told about our culture is not true. That, even if, the midwives in Alabama don't say a word about Africa, she makes Africa live. She's implementing Africa. And so for someone like you to go around and say, we're going to find out who these people are, we're going to appreciate them, we're going to pass this information on to our kids, is really, really, really important. And it may seem, like a small thing or a difficult thing. I know it took you, I don't know what the next leg of your journey is now. You have to tell her where she's headed next. But, so far, the work that she's been doing, with excavating this information and tying it together has been so, so valuable. And I just want to say thank you very much for making sure this is a priority and defining it. How many of us can't even define what resistance is going to look like? We just get frustrated. What should I do? That's a very, very, very creative way to apply your sense and determination to make sure that Black people survive with dignity and fervor.
Thank you so much. That's why I love Sankofa. Sankofa is a healing place. The words here, the books here, you here, Holly here. I mean, it's just an incredible place. And the people who come here, right, for this conversation and this discussion. And I think that, this whole idea of not allowing ourselves to be defeated, period, just ain't going to happen. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a very, very special moment. Very special.
Do we have one more question here? Is that fine with you?
This is the last one, I think.
Okay, last question.
All right.
I think you had the first one and the last one.
Yay. All right. I'm an element Pisces, so I open and close the circle. So, as you know, Black women have the highest mortality rate during childbirth in this country. Will having a midwife in the birthing process, during the birthing process, reduce that number? How do we get there? Should there be policy changes? Should we have insurance that allows that to happen so we can deliberately reduce those numbers, because anti-Black sentiments do feed into those numbers? And also, if you could talk about what you would like people to take away from this very important book.
We are at a point, it's really important to understand that, and I think the doctor referred to it as well, that the whole issue of infant mortality is a very complicated issue, right? There are lots of things that lead to healthy outcomes. So you can have a wonderful midwife, right? Or you can birth at a birthing center, but if you're not taking care of yourself or have challenges taking care of yourself, if you are dealing with the whole idea of this, the trauma of racism, the psychological issues, if you don't have a job, if you don't have an adequate income. And infant mortality often reflects a lot more than the actual childbirth experience. And those of us who do public health, we look at the infant mortality as kind of a measure of the overall well-being of the community. So that as Black folks, we're challenged on many levels. And if we think that if we fix the hospital situation that will solve the infant mortality issue, or even if we say if every mama has a midwife, then we're going to solve the problem, because that is one part of solving the problem. But where we live, who we're surrounded by, what we're eating, the issue of rest and restoration, all those kinds of things, which is one of the things that I loved about the traditional midwives. They were all for that 6 to 8 weeks of rest and restoration following birth. And now there was kind of that feminist thing about we're going to get up from super mama, and we're going to go right back to work, and all of that. But having those social supports, so it's complicated. And I think that as long as we keep in mind that it's complex, so that we don't say if we just have midwives and doulas and birth centers everywhere, everything will be solved, because there will still be women, as the doctor pointed out, who have complications that are best served in a hospital or medical setting if it is not polluted by the racism and the white supremacy and the ignoring our voices, whether we're a doctor or whether we're a working class person. It's complicated, but I'm optimistic that just the idea that we're now calling it a birthing justice movement, I think is really, gives me a sense that that things are moving in the direction that they need to be moving in, and usually when that happens, we're faced with more challenges. So I think the fact that we have more midwives out there, more doulas out there, and that we're familiar with the birthing justice movement as a way to approach this problem does make me think that 10 years from now, they won't have killed us yet. Oh, signing books. Oh, if anyone, yes.
So thank you so much once again. I don't know if you want to take a couple of minutes to break and then start signing books.
Yeah, you just sort of.
Yes. Okay, so if you want to purchase your book and then meet Miss Linda, as the doctor called you, I love the way that she incorporated, that was so sweet. Here to have your book signed, please meet us back here in 3 minutes.
Okay.